Well, there's two standards organizations in the United States, Underwriters Laboratory and Builders Hardware Manufacturers Association. The problem with standards is they're out of date, they're not updated for several years at a time, and they are very limited in what they test. And so we actually set up a security lab for testing beyond what the standards look for, because this is the real way to open locks and safes. Well, obviously locksmiths are more competent to evaluate locks. The consumer and Home Depot, retail vendors, they're really not set up or competent to evaluate any level of security. It's not their job. Their job is to sell locks. And they leave this to the standards organizations, to the manufacturers' expertise. Locksmiths, some locksmiths know how to determine whether locks are secure or not, but again, in most cases, it's not their job. Their job is to sell, install, and service locks. And so, again, this falls on the standards organizations to rate locks so that everybody can rely on these ratings. And that's where the system fails, because the ratings aren't covering a lot of techniques that we've developed to open very high security locks, to say nothing of residential and low-level security. Now, the Builders Hardware Manufacturers Association, BHMA, has grading, 3 grades for cylinders. Grade 1 is the highest level of security. But this doesn't have anything to do with the actual lock. It's the hardware that the lock controls. So when they rate a deadbolt as a grade 1 level of security, the deadbolt may be secure, but the lock that controls it is a different rating, so UL or BHMA. And so it can be very deceptive, because packaging on a lot of these products say, okay, we have the highest security deadbolt, for example. It's a grade 1 deadbolt, and you can't force it, you can't saw it, you can't do all these things. But that doesn't have anything to do with the lock that controls the deadbolt. So if I can bump open the lock, or pick it or force it open in 30 seconds or less, the deadbolt is secure, but it doesn't matter, because the deadbolt's being controlled by the lock. First, you tell them there's a problem. They tell you, no, there's no problem. They tell you how brilliant their engineers are and that their locks are patented. First of all, patents mean nothing. They have nothing to do with security. They have to do with uniqueness, non-obviousness, and utility. So when they tell us, if you talk about our locks negatively, we're going to sue you, because it's libel, it's defamation, it's just not true. And of course, my attitude has always been, I'll meet you at the courthouse, because we always document very carefully what we do. And a lot of locks, manufacturers don't know how to open their own locks in many cases. Design engineers know how to design locks. They know how to make things work. But most design engineers, unfortunately, didn't grow up breaking things. And it's sort of a skill that you have to grow up with as a little kid, looking at everything and say, how can I break this? And so there's security engineering and there's mechanical engineering, and the two are very different. They intersect, obviously, but the two are very different. So most lock manufacturers have told me, this isn't true, you don't know what you're talking about, our locks can't be broken. Some of them obviously listen and say, okay, what's the problem? But many of them, they're pretty arrogant in many cases, and they just say, look, we know all about our locks and you don't, and we only have UL and BHMA and independent testing laboratories, or our own testing people test. Well, that doesn't mean anything. UL doesn't test for the kind of things we test for, and so it doesn't prove anything. So what? Yeah, UL passed all these locks that can be bumped open in seconds. Means nothing. Not happily. Actually, we are now working for the largest lock companies in the world, both in the United States and overseas, because they have finally recognized that maybe they need another level of testing above the standards, which is a good thing. I mean, look, if we can move the industry in this direction, this works because the consumer obtains higher security products, and that's the end of the day, the goal. And so we're working now for many major lock manufacturers testing their locks outside the standards. We have no qualms with the way UL is testing or the way BHMA is testing. It's just that they're prohibited, because of the way the standards are written, from testing a lot of bypass techniques that are commonly known and a lot of them that are not commonly known. But once you figure it out, it's a problem. And honestly, there's no secrets anymore. It's called the internet. And so once a bypass technique is determined, it doesn't matter how bright you are to figure it out. Everybody says, well, you guys are the experts on the planet, so obviously you've figured it out, but nobody else can. Well, that's not really true. And once somebody figures it out and communicates it on the internet in 24 hours, all the bad guys know about it. The only people that don't know about it are the consumers, because nobody will tell them. Well, we're going to start putting out ratings on some fairly popular locks when our clients ask us to, because I've really made a career out of going after insecure products as a lawyer. And this at the end of the day, this is all about liability. If somebody gets hurt, somebody's going to be liable for it, and so it behooves the manufacturers, and they're recognizing this. Let's design our products properly to begin with. So we're going to come out with some ratings on some fairly common locks and maybe some that aren't, in order to warn the consumer. And we've posted security alerts over the years on our website, security.org, to alert the consumers, like the laptop locks and the bike locks and, you know, lock bumping, for example. My associates and I were instrumental in bringing that to the United States. It has turned out to be a huge security problem. At the beginning in 2006, when we introduced it here, and our colleagues in Europe introduced it the year before in Europe, everybody thought, this isn't a problem. Well, all the major manufacturers are now addressing lock bumping. The American Society of Testing and Materials is now coming out with a standard, ASTM, on lock bumping that's going to be incorporated into other standards. And so we were 4 years ahead in warning everybody. And at the beginning, everybody says, oh, you shouldn't tell the consumer, you shouldn't unnecessarily raise the alarm. Well, I think the consumers have a right and a need to know. Now, do we disclose vulnerabilities in high security locks that could impact national security? No, we go to government agencies. But at the consumer and commercial level, we think that everybody ought to understand the risks. It's not the locksmith's locks, it's the consumer's locks. So let the consumer understand the risk so they can either accept it or not accept it and buy better locks. A deadbolt is a piece of hardware that secures the door to the door frame. The lock is inserted into the deadbolt hardware, and it actually controls the deadbolt, whether it's locked or unlocked. So when you stick your key into the lock, that controls the mechanism, whether it's a latch, a night latch, or a deadbolt. And so the two of them obviously work together, but they're totally separate. And one can be very secure, but what's the weakest link in the chain? If the lock can be compromised in 10 seconds and the deadbolt takes 5 minutes to compromise, it's still 10 seconds. And so the consumer needs to understand they can buy better locks. They can buy great hardware, but if the locks aren't secure, it doesn't mean anything. Oh, it's easy. I mean, everything's like mortise cylinders. They're screw-in cylinders like you see on all the metal doors on businesses. It's everything's standard. So you can unscrew one, and basically all of the major manufacturers interchange their locks. Well, assuming the manufacturers understand the vulnerabilities of their locks, that's the first assumption. Assuming they do, they ought to be communicating it to the vendors. The problem is they don't want to do that because if the vendors knew, for example, that the lock could be opened in 30 seconds or 10 seconds, they're not going to sell it because they don't want to be liable to the end user. And so this is a real problem for the industry that the industry really needs to address. Now, they all say, well, we meet the standards. Okay, but if you can open the lock in 10 seconds outside of the standards, as we demonstrated to you with one of the fingerprint locks, the standards don't mean anything whether they're rated or not. The consumers really need to be educated so they know what to buy. For the most part, no, they're not. Why would they want to do that? Because the minute they do that, they may be buying a recall, a class action lawsuit, all kinds of problems. So this is a game that everybody's been playing for a long time, and it's not just the lock industry, it's everywhere.